They lowered my son's casket into the ground, and that's when she made her move. I stood there in my black suit, hands trembling, watching 25 years disappear into the earth. My only child, gone at 47. Heart attack, no warning, no goodbye. The guests gathered at the cemetery, faces blurred by grief and shock. That's when my daughter-in-law grabbed the microphone from the pastor's hand. "I have an announcement," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of muffled sobs. Every head turned. 25 years is enough. She looked directly at me, her eyes cold, calculating. "I want someone younger. And you," she paused for effect, pointing at me in front of everyone. "I want you out of my apartment by tomorrow morning." Gasps rippled through the crowd. My daughter grabbed my arm. Whispers erupted. She smiled, the kind of smile that comes when you think you've already won. But she forgot one very important detail. The apartment was mine. I walked toward her slowly, took the microphone from her manicured fingers, and said 5 words that shattered her entire world. What happened next? Stay with me, because this betrayal is only the beginning, and what I do in revenge will leave you breathless. My name is Edward Cole. I'm 65 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building bridges that connected cities and lives. I never imagined I'd be standing at my son's grave, watching the only structure that ever truly mattered to me crumble into the earth. The rain came down in cold, relentless sheets that afternoon, turning the cemetery grass to mud and blurring the faces of the mourners gathered around Daniel's casket. I stood at the front closest to the grave, clutching the pocket watch my son had given me on my 60th birthday. The metal was warm against my palm, heated by the grip of my trembling hand. Daniel was 47. 47 years of laughter, of late-night conversations about everything, and nothing of a smile that could light up the darkest room. Gone. A sudden heart attack, they said. No warning. No time to say goodbye. I watched the casket descend slowly into the ground, mahogany polished to a mirror, shine already streaked with rainwater. The pastor's voice droned on about peace and rest and God's mysterious plan, but the words barely registered. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, heavy and irregular, matching the rhythm of the rain against my umbrella. Around me, Daniel's friends and colleagues stood in silence, their heads bowed, their grief palpable. My daughter-in-law Madison stood to my right, dressed in black designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her face was composed, almost serene, as if she were posing for a photograph rather than burying her husband. The pastor was mid-sentence, something about eternal rest, when Madison moved. She didn't ask permission or wait for an appropriate pause. She simply reached over, plucked the microphone from his hand, and stepped forward to the edge of the grave. The pastor stumbled back, confused, as Madison's heels sank slightly into the soft earth. I looked up, surprised, assuming she wanted to say a few words about Daniel, perhaps share a memory, express her grief. Instead, her voice cut through the rain like a blade through silk. 25 years is enough, she said, her tone clear and cold, amplified by the small speaker clipped to the pastor's vestments. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Madison's eyes swept across the mourners, landing on me with the precision of a marksman. "I want someone younger," she continued, and I saw her lips curve into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And you," she pointed directly at me, her finger steady despite the rain. "I want you out of my apartment by tomorrow." The cemetery fell silent. Even the rain seemed to pause, holding its breath. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I saw phones rise, cameras aimed, recording the moment for some unknown audience that would judge us all later. Whispers erupted like small fires catching in dry grass. Daniel's best friend from college stared at Madison with his mouth open. His secretary wiped tears from her face, but now they seemed less about grief and more about shock. My own heart, already heavy with loss, turned to ice in my chest. For a moment I couldn't move. I stood there, Daniel's watch burning in my hand, and I felt the full weight of her cruelty settle over me like a shroud. This woman, who had stood beside my son for 8 years, had chosen this moment, this sacred, irreplaceable moment, to humiliate me, to stake her claim, to remind everyone present that she held the power now, and I was simply an old man in her way. But I had spent 4 decades building structures that could withstand storms, earthquakes, and time itself. I knew something about foundations, about what holds when pressure is applied. And I knew in that instant that Madison had made a mistake. She thought grief had weakened me, She thought I would crumble. I released the watch, letting it slip back into my coat pocket, and stepped forward. The mud sucked at my shoes as I walked slowly, deliberately to where Madison stood. I didn't ask for the microphone. I simply held out my hand, and something in my expression made her surrender it without protest. I turned to face the crowd, these people who had loved my son, and I let the silence stretch until every eye was on me. Then I looked directly at Madison, my voice quiet but edged with steel that had been forged in decades of discipline and restraint. "You just buried your future." The words hung in the air between us for only a moment before I turned and walked away, leaving Madison standing alone by my son's grave. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see her face to know that something had shifted. The crowd parted as I moved through them, and I felt their eyes following me, their whispers trailing in my wake like the hem of a funeral shroud. The reception was held at a hotel conference room downtown, one of those generic spaces with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that tried too hard to be warm and failed completely. Long tables lined with plastic-wrapped sandwich platters and sweating pitchers of iced tea stretched along one wall. People clustered in small groups, speaking in the hushed tones reserved for funerals, their voices a low murmur beneath the artificial hum of the air conditioning. I stood near the back, a paper cup of coffee cooling in my hand, watching. Madison had transformed. The cold, calculated woman from the cemetery had vanished, replaced by a performance of grief so polished it could have won awards. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, accepting condolences from Daniel's co-workers with trembling hands and a voice that broke at precisely the right moments. A few photographers from the local newspaper circled discreetly, and Madison turned toward them with the instinct of someone who understood angles and lighting. Her black dress fit perfectly. Her hair fell in artful waves. She looked every inch the devastated young widow, but I watched her hands. They told a different story. Between conversations, between hugs from well-meaning strangers, Madison's fingers moved constantly over her phone screen. She typed, rapidly paused, smiled at something she read, then typed again. At one point, a young man in an expensive suit approached her table. I recognized the type immediately. Corporate lawyer, probably mid-30s, the kind who measured success in billable hours and corner offices. Madison's entire demeanor shifted when he sat down beside her. The grief evaporated. Her smile became genuine, almost playful. I moved closer, positioning myself near a cluster of Daniel's college friends, close enough to hear fragments of conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. Madison leaned toward the lawyer, her voice low but not quite low enough. "How quickly can we liquidate the stock options?" she asked. The lawyer glanced around nervously before responding. "If the paperwork is in order, maybe 2 weeks. 3 at most. And the accounts, once probate clears, we can start closing them. But Madison, you need to be careful. If there are any challenges to the will, there won't be," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I've made sure of that." The lawyer nodded, but his expression suggested doubt. Madison touched his arm lightly, leaning closer, and said something I couldn't hear. Whatever it was made him smile. They weren't discussing my son's death. They were discussing profit margins. I turned away before my expression could betray me, focusing instead on the coffee in my cup, now cold and bitter. A woman I didn't recognize walked past carrying a tray of cookies, and the artificial sweetness of the air freshener, mixed with the smell of cheap coffee, made my stomach turn. I set the cup down on a nearby table and watched as Madison reached into her designer handbag, presumably for lipstick or a compact. Her hand fumbled for a moment, and something small and silver tumbled out, clattering onto the table between her and the lawyer. A key. Even from where I stood, I could see the engraving on its surface, catching the fluorescent light. Madison's hand shot out, snatching it up with a speed that suggested panic, but not before I'd seen the numbers etched into the metal vault 213. She glanced around quickly, checking to see if anyone had noticed. Her eyes passed over me without recognition, and she slipped the key back into her purse, zipping it closed with deliberate care. The lawyer raised an eyebrow, but Madison waved him off with a forced laugh and a comment I couldn't hear. I filed the information away. Vault 213. I didn't know what it opened. A safe deposit box, perhaps, or a storage unit. But the nervous way she'd grabbed it told me everything I needed to know. Whatever that key unlocked, it was something Madison very much wanted to keep hidden. Edward I turned to find Robert Chen standing beside me, one of Daniel's oldest friends from his engineering days. Robert held a glass of water and wore the exhausted expression of someone who'd been crying recently. We'd met a dozen times over the years at birthday parties and holiday dinners. He was a good man, steady and honest. "I'm so sorry," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Daniel was like a brother to me." "Thank you," I managed. "He spoke highly of you." Robert nodded, then hesitated, glancing toward where Madison sat with her lawyer. When he spoke again, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I don't know if this helps, but Daniel called me about 3 weeks ago, late at night. He sounded stressed." Robert paused, choosing his words carefully. "He said Madison was pressuring him to change his will. She wanted more control over the assets, wanted her name on everything. Daniel refused. He told me he was starting to see a side of her he didn't." The coffee I'd drunk earlier turned to acid in my stomach. Did he say anything else? Just that he was worried? He asked if I thought he was being paranoid. Robert's eyes met mine, and I saw the guilt there. I told him marriage was complicated. I told him to talk to her, work it out. His voice cracked. I should have told him to protect himself. Before I could respond, I felt eyes on me. I looked up to find Madison staring directly at me from across the room. The grieving widow mask had slipped just for a moment, and what I saw beneath it was cold calculation. She smiled, slow and deliberate, then mouthed words meant only for me. "Don't look at me like that, landlord." I left the reception early, claiming exhaustion that wasn't entirely a lie. The weight of Madison's words followed me out into the parking lot, where the rain had finally stopped but left the pavement slick and reflecting the gray sky above. I drove back to my hotel room and spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every glance, every detail I'd observed. Sleep came in fragments, broken by memories of Daniel as a child, as a teenager, as the man he'd become. By morning, I knew I couldn't leave this city until I understood what had really happened to my son. 2 days later, I sat in the downtown office of Mr. Harris, Daniel's attorney. The law firm occupied the 20th floor of a glass tower, all polished wood and leather chairs that whispered money and discretion. Harris himself was in his early 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of measured calm that comes from decades of handling other people's crises. He'd called me the morning after the funeral, asking if we could meet to discuss some legal matters regarding the apartment. I'd agreed immediately, sensing there was more he needed to say than could be conveyed over the phone. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Cole," Harris said as he gestured for me to sit. His desk was neat, organized with a single manila folder placed precisely in the center. "I know this is a difficult time, but there are some things we need to address." "The apartment deed," I said. "Madison seems to believe it belongs to her." Harris's expression remained neutral, professional. "The deed is in your name, as you know. It has been for 15 years. Daniel and Madison lived there as your guests, though I suspect she either didn't know or chose to ignore that fact." He paused, his fingers resting on the manila folder. "But that's not why I asked you here." He opened the folder and withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored and slightly worn at the edges, as though it had been handled many times. My name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting, the letters careful and deliberate. "Daniel left this with me 18 months ago," Harris said quietly. "He gave me very specific instructions. He said, 'If anything happens to me, give this to my father. Not before. He'll know when he needs it.'" Harris slid the envelope across the desk toward me. "I think that time is now." My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. The paper felt thin, fragile, as if the words inside might dissolve if I held them too tightly. I broke the seal carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper folded twice. Daniel's handwriting covered both sides, smaller and more cramped than usual, as if he'd been trying to fit as much as possible into a limited space. The letter began without preamble. "Dad, if you're reading this, something has happened to me and I need you to know the truth. I couldn't tell you while I was alive." My throat constricted and I had to stop forcing myself to breathe before continuing. Daniel wrote about his marriage, about how he'd realized within the first year that Madison had loved the idea of security more than she'd loved him. He described feeling invisible in his own home, how every decision became a negotiation, weighted in her favor, how she'd slowly isolated him from friends who questioned her motives. "I stayed because I'm weak, Dad," he wrote. "I stayed because leaving felt like admitting failure, and I didn't want to disappoint you. I know now that was the real failure." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I kept reading. Daniel wrote about his regrets, about plans he'd made to leave but never followed through on, about the fear that had kept him paralyzed. And then at the bottom of the second page, his handwriting grew bolder, more determined. Dad, finish what I started. The foundation is the key. Don't let her erase me. I know you'll do what I couldn't stand up to her and make something good from all of this. I love you. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough. Daniel. I looked up at Harris, the letter shaking in my hands. What foundation? Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. 3 years ago, Daniel came to me with plans for a charitable foundation. He called it the Daniel Cole Foundation. It was going to focus on heart disease, research, literacy programs, scholarships for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. He'd worked out every detail, mission statement, funding structure, governance. It was brilliant, actually. The kind of legacy that could have changed lives. What happened to it? Madison Harris said simply. When Daniel told her about it, she insisted it be renamed the Madison Cole Foundation. She wanted top billing, wanted to be the face of it. Daniel refused. He said the work mattered more than whose name was on the letterhead. They fought about it for months. Eventually, she gave him an ultimatum, her name or no foundation at all. Daniel chose to shelve the project rather than let her co-opt it for her own image. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steadier, now my grief hardening into something else entirely. My son had tried to build something meaningful, something that would outlast him, and Madison had killed it out of pure vanity. She hadn't just taken my son from me. She'd taken his dreams too. My phone rang, shattering the silence of Harris's office. I glanced at the screen. Madison. I answered without speaking. Her voice came through cold and sharp, each word enunciated with deliberate precision. You'll regret coming back to this city. I ended the call without responding and set the phone face down on Harris's desk. The threat had been empty, theatrical, the kind of intimidation tactic Madison probably expected would send me running back to whatever quiet life she imagined I'd come from. She didn't know me. She didn't know that 40 years of engineering had taught me that the strongest structures are built on solid foundations, and right now, I was standing on bedrock while she balanced on sand. Mr. Harris, I said, looking up at the lawyer, I'm going to need copies of that deed. Multiple copies. Notarized. Harris nodded slowly, understanding passing between us without further explanation. I'll have them ready by this afternoon. 3 days later, I was back at the apartment, the place Daniel had called home for the last 8 years of his life. It was a spacious 2-bedroom on the Upper East Side, the kind of address that impressed people at dinner parties and cost more per month than most people earned in a year. I'd bought it as an investment property when Daniel first moved to the city, never imagining he'd end up living there with a wife who believed she owned it. The doorman recognized me and waved me through with a sad smile that suggested he'd heard about Daniel's death. I took the elevator to the 14th floor, my briefcase in one hand, and Daniel's letter folded carefully in my jacket pocket, a reminder of why I was here. I'd barely inserted my key into the lock when the door swung open from the inside. Madison stood there, and behind her a man in a gray suit clutching a leather portfolio. Her lawyer, I presumed. Madison's eyes were sharp, her posture aggressive, and I noticed immediately that her phone was already out, propped on a small tripod she'd set up on the entry table, its camera lens pointed directly at the doorway. You can't just walk in here, Madison said loudly, clearly performing for the camera. This is my home. My husband just died and you're harassing me. I glanced at the phone, then back at her. Good afternoon, Madison. May I come in? No, she said, but I stepped inside anyway, closing the door behind me with deliberate calm. The apartment looked different than I remembered. Daniel's belongings had already been cleared away, his bookshelves emptied, his photographs removed from the walls. It was as if he'd been erased in less than a week. Madison's lawyer stepped forward, his expression professionally stern. Mr. Cole, my client has asked you to leave. If you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to call the authorities. I'm not going anywhere, I said evenly. This is my apartment. Madison laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Your apartment, Daniel and I have lived here for 8 years. This is our home. My home. Actually, I said, setting my briefcase down on the coffee table and opening it with slow, deliberate movements. Daniel lived here as my guest. You lived here as his guest. But the apartment has always belonged to me. I withdrew a folder thick with documents and placed it on the table between us. The original deed purchased 15 years ago. My name, notarized and recorded with the city. Would you like to see it? The lawyer moved quickly, snatching up the folder and flipping through its contents. I watched his face change as he read the professional confidence draining away, replaced by something closer to resignation. He looked up at Madison, then back at the documents, then at Madison again. "Miss Cole," he said quietly, "these documents are legitimate. The property is registered to Edward Cole, has been since 2010. Madison's face went white. She reached for her phone, her hand hovering over it as if she might stop the recording, but pride or stubbornness kept her from admitting defeat so publicly. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and said, "Fine, then I'll move out. Today, I don't need your charity." "Actually," I said, and something in my tone made both of them freeze. "You can stay." Madison blinked, confused. The lawyer looked equally uncertain. "I'm not a cruel man, Madison. You've just lost your husband. You're grieving. I understand that finding a new place takes time." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. "So here's what I'm offering. You can continue living here, but starting today you'll pay rent. Market rate, $15,000 a month, due on the 1st. Late fees apply after the 5th. Madison's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole, that's quite generous given the circumstances, but I'm not finished." I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying an edge that made both of them go still. "The lease will be month to month. No long-term security. If you miss a payment, you're out. If you damage the property, you're out. And every month when you write that check, you'll remember exactly whose roof is keeping you dry." Madison's face flushed red anger and humiliation warring in her expression. "You can't do this. You can't humiliate me like this." "I'm not humiliating you," I said quietly. "I'm offering you a place to live. Whether you choose to see that as humiliation is entirely up to you." I reached into my briefcase again and withdrew a rental agreement. Harris had prepared standard lease terms printed on crisp white paper. I set it on the table next to the deed and produced a pen, placing it carefully on top. "Sign it or start packing. Your choice." Madison stared at the papers, her hands trembling with rage or fear or some combination of both. Her lawyer leaned close, whispering something I couldn't hear. Finally, she snatched up the pen and signed her name with violent slashing strokes. I countersigned calmly, tore off her copy, and handed it to her. "First payment is due in 3 days," I said, picking up my briefcase and walking toward the door. I paused with my hand on the handle and looked back at her. "Every payment will remind you whose house this really is." I left the apartment that day with a sense of satisfaction that lasted exactly as long as it took me to reach the storage facility where Daniel had kept his personal belongings. Madison had given me the access code reluctantly, along with a curt text message informing me I had 1 week to clear it out before she stopped paying the monthly fee. The facility was in Queens, a squat concrete building surrounded by chain-link fence, the kind of place where people stored the pieces of their lives they couldn't quite throw away but didn't want to look at every day. The unit was small, maybe 10 feet by 10, and when I rolled up the metal door, the musty smell of cardboard and old paper hit me immediately. Boxes were stacked 3 high along the back wall, labeled in Daniel's neat handwriting, "Books, college papers, tax records, 2015 to 2018. I'd come looking for documents, for financial records that might explain the vault key or the account transfers Madison had mentioned to her lawyer. What I found instead was a shoebox tucked behind a larger container, unmarked and secured with a rubber band that snapped when I tried to remove it. Inside were letters, dozens of them written on different types of paper, some typed, some handwritten, all addressed to me. None of them had ever been mailed. The envelopes weren't even sealed, just folded closed as if Daniel had intended to send them but never found the courage. I sat down on a plastic storage container and opened the first one, dated 3 years ago. "Dad," it began, "I'm writing this at 2 in the morning because Madison is asleep, and this is the only time I feel like I can be honest, even if it's just to paper." My hands started shaking before I'd finished the first paragraph. Daniel wrote about feeling invisible in his own home, about how Madison only seemed to notice him when she needed something signed or wanted him to attend some social function where his engineering credentials made her look good. "She touches my hand at parties," he wrote, "but it's for the photographers, not for me. I don't think she's looked me in the eye in months." I read through letter after letter, each one a window into my son's loneliness. He wrote about lying awake at night, wondering if he'd made a mistake about the growing distance between them, about conversations that felt more like negotiations than expressions of love. In one letter from 18 months ago, he'd written, "I feel like I'm disappearing, Dad. Like I'm becoming less real every day, just a signature on her documents, just a name that gives her credibility. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if it can be fixed." I had to stop reading. The storage unit felt too small, the air too thick. I stood up, paced the narrow space between the boxes, trying to process the depth of Daniel's suffering. He'd been drowning and I hadn't known. I'd called every few weeks, asked how he was doing, and he'd always said fine. Always fine. The letters proved that was a lie, and I'd been too distant, too trusting to see through it. I forced myself to keep sorting through the boxes, pushing past the grief that threatened to paralyze me. In a filing container marked MISC Projects, I found a dusty manila folder that caught my attention because of its title, written in marker across the tab. The Madison Cole Foundation Proposal Draft 2015. I opened it carefully, and what I found inside was remarkable. Page after page of detailed planning, a complete blueprint for a charitable organization focused on supporting young women starting businesses. The mission statement was eloquent, passionate, even describing a vision of mentorship and opportunity for women who'd grown up without resources. Financial projections, partnership strategies, fundraising timelines. Everything was there, professionally formatted and thoroughly researched. This had been Madison's dream once. I could see it in the care she'd put into every page and the specificity of her goals. For a brief moment, I almost felt sympathy for her. Almost. Then I found the notes Daniel had added in the margins dated 6 months after the proposal. Suggested joint leadership she refused. Said she didn't want to share credit with someone who doesn't understand branding. Told her the mission mattered more than whose name was on it. She hasn't mentioned it since. Madison had abandoned this entire project, this genuinely meaningful work, because Daniel wouldn't let her take sole credit. She'd valued her image more than the impact the foundation could have had. I closed the folder and added it to the small pile of items I was taking with me. Later that evening, I returned to the apartment to drop off some documents Harris needed. I let myself in quietly, and through the bedroom doorway, I saw Madison sitting on the bed, surrounded by photograph albums. She held an old wedding picture in her hands, the kind taken by professional photographers with soft lighting and fake autumn leaves scattered artfully on the ground. As I watched, she tore the photo cleanly down the middle. Daniel's half went into the wastebasket beside the bed without hesitation. She kept her half, holding it up to the lamplight, studying her own face at 24 younger and unmarked by the years that had followed. She smiled slightly, touching her cheek in the photograph as if mourning something lost. She wasn't grieving Daniel. She was grieving her youth, the version of herself that photograph had captured. I backed away silently, returning to the living room with a clarity I hadn't possessed before. Madison wasn't capable of love. Not really. She was capable only of acquisition, of holding on to things and people as long as they served her purpose. I sat down at Daniel's old desk and opened the foundation folder again, reading through Madison's careful plans and Daniel's marginal notes. An idea began to form, something that felt right in a way nothing else had since I'd received the news of my son's death. I closed the folder and whispered to the empty room. She wanted a legacy. Now I know exactly where to begin. The foundation folder sat on my hotel room desk for 2 days, while I tried to decide what to do with it. During that time, I found myself thinking about something Daniel had told me years ago. A confession that had come late one night over the phone when he'd had too much to drink and his defenses were down. I'd been in my workshop at home building a birdhouse for a neighbor's grandson when my phone rang at 11:30. Daniel's voice had been thick with emotion, barely controlled. "Dad," he'd said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." There was a long pause, and I'd heard him breathing heavily on the other end. Madison was pregnant. First year we were married. I didn't even know until after. She ended it without telling me. When I found out, when I asked her why, she said his voice had broken then and I'd heard him crying. She said she wasn't going to ruin her body for a baby. Those were her exact words. Ruin her body. I'd driven into the city the next morning, met him for breakfast at a diner near his office. I'd urged him to reconsider the marriage, told him that a partnership built on such fundamental differences couldn't sustain itself. Daniel had listened, nodded, thanked me for caring. Then he'd gone home to her anyway, convinced that time would soften her, that love could change someone who didn't want to be changed. I'd watched him choose hope over reality, and I'd hated myself for not pushing harder. Now, sitting in my hotel room with Daniel's bank statements spread across the bed, that memory felt like a puzzle piece I'd been carrying without knowing where it fit. I'd spent the morning going through Daniel's personal financial records documents Harris had provided as part of settling the estate. Most of it was routine, the standard flow of salary deposits and bill payments, credit card charges for groceries and gas. But one set of transactions stood out because of their regularity and their specificity. Every month on the 15th, Daniel had transferred exactly $500 to something labeled Guardian Trust Emma C. The payments had started 24 months ago and continued right up until the week before his death. I had no idea who Emma C. was. The name meant nothing to me. Daniel had never mentioned an Emma, never spoken of setting up a trust. I checked through every document Harris had given me, every file in Daniel's storage unit, and found nothing that explained the payments. The next morning, I called the bank and asked to speak with someone in their trust services department. After being transferred 3 times and providing documentation proving I was executor of Daniel's estate, I finally reached a representative named Patricia, who spoke in the measured, careful tones of someone trained to handle sensitive information. The Guardian Trust was established 2 years ago, Patricia explained after pulling up the account. The beneficiary is a minor child, Emma Carter, age 8. The trust was set up to provide monthly support payments until the child reaches 18 or completes secondary education, whichever comes later. Who is Emma Carter? I asked. There was a pause, the sound of typing. According to our records, Emma Carter is the daughter of Melissa Carter, who passed away 26 months ago. The trust documentation lists her as the niece of Madison Cole. The information hit me like cold water. Madison had a sister who'd died, a sister who'd left behind a daughter, and Daniel had been supporting that child secretly for 2 years while Madison presumably did nothing. What happened to Melissa Carter? I asked. I'm not at liberty to discuss details beyond what's in the trust documentation, Patricia said, her voice apologetic. But the death certificate on file lists cause of death as acute drug toxicity, overdose. I thanked Patricia and ended the call, my mind racing. Madison had a niece, an 8-year-old girl who'd lost her mother to addiction, and rather than taking the child in or supporting her publicly, Madison had apparently pretended the girl didn't exist. Daniel characteristically had stepped in, quietly setting up a trust to ensure Emma had at least some financial support. $500 a month wasn't enough to raise a child, but it was something. It was Daniel trying to fix what Madison refused to acknowledge. I called Patricia back. I need to see the complete trust documentation, I said. Everything. I need to understand the full scope of Daniel's arrangement. The documents arrived by secure email 2 hours later. I read through page after page of legal language, beneficiary designations, payment schedules, and trustee responsibilities. Daniel had structured everything carefully, ensuring the money would flow automatically, that Emma would be protected even if something happened to him. And then at the bottom of the final page, I found the line that changed everything. Successor trustee, upon the death or incapacitation of Daniel Cole, Edward Cole. My son had named me. He'd built a safety net for a child Madison had abandoned, and he'd made sure that safety net would hold even after he was gone. I stared at my name on the document, typed in Daniel's characteristic Times New Roman font, and felt the full weight of the responsibility he'd quietly placed on my shoulders. Emma Carter was my responsibility now. A child I'd never met, whose existence I'd been unaware of until this moment, was depending on me to continue what Daniel had started. I picked up my phone and called Harris. I need you to help me find Emma Carter, I said, and I need to know everything about her situation. Everything. Harris got back to me within 24 hours, with Emma's information, and what I learned made my chest tighten, with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Emma was living with a foster family in Brooklyn, attending 3rd grade at a public school, and by all accounts, adjusting as well as could be expected for a child who'd lost her mother before she was old enough to understand why. The foster family was kind but stretched thin financially, caring for 3 other children in a 2-bedroom apartment. Daniel's $500 a month had been making the difference between adequate care and real stability. Now that responsibility was mine, and I intended to honor it. But first, I needed to understand something that had been nagging at me since the funeral. a question that wouldn't let me rest. That evening alone in my hotel room, I finally allowed myself to examine Daniel's pocket watch properly. I'd clutched it at the graveside, carried it with me every day since, but I hadn't opened it. The watch had been a gift from Daniel on my 60th birthday, a beautiful piece with a silver case and Roman numerals on its face, the kind of timepiece that belonged to an earlier era when craftsmanship mattered more than efficiency. I'd been deeply moved when he gave it to me, and I'd worn it proudly until my own retirement, when I'd returned it to him, telling him it should stay in the family, passed down through the generations. He'd smiled and accepted it, and I'd seen him wearing it at every family gathering since. Now I sat at the small desk by the window, the watch heavy in my palm, and carefully pressed the release that opened the back casing. I expected to find perhaps a photo tucked inside, or maybe a small recording device, some piece of modern technology Daniel might have hidden there to leave me a message. Engineers think in systems, in documented proof, in evidence that can be measured and verified. I was prepared for that. Instead, I found a tiny scroll of paper rolled so tightly it was barely thicker than a matchstick. I unrolled it with trembling fingers, and Daniel's handwriting appeared impossibly small but perfectly legible. "Dad, the answer isn't in technology. It's in her eyes. Watch how she looks at you when she thinks she's won. That's all the proof you need." I read the words 3 times, then set the paper down on the desk and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. Daniel had known me well enough to predict exactly what I'd do after his death. He'd known I'd go searching for documentation, for bank records and legal papers, for the kind of concrete evidence that could be presented in a courtroom. He'd been right. I'd spent days gathering statements and deeds and trust documents, building a case the way I'd once built bridges, with careful attention to load-bearing facts and structural integrity. But Daniel's message was telling me something different. He was reminding me that Madison's greatest vulnerability wasn't something that could be captured on paper. It was her pride, her absolute certainty that she was smarter than everyone around her, that her beauty and charm made her untouchable. I'd seen it in every interaction we'd had since the funeral. The way she'd smirked at me across the wake, mouthing "landlord," as if the word itself was a weapon. The way she'd live-streamed our confrontation at the apartment, so confident in her narrative that she hadn't even considered I might have proof of ownership. The way her face had flushed when I'd offered her the lease, not with shame but with rage at being outmaneuvered. I thought back through every moment I'd observed her. At the funeral, when she'd seized the microphone, her eyes had been bright, almost excited, as if she were performing for an audience that existed only in her mind. At the wake, when she'd been talking to that lawyer about liquidating assets, she'd been animated, engaged, fully present in a way she never was when people offered condolences. And at the apartment, when her lawyer had confirmed the deed was legitimate, I'd seen something flicker across her face before the anger set in. Not surprise, recognition. She'd known on some level that she'd overplayed her hand, but her pride wouldn't let her back down gracefully. Daniel was right. Madison would reveal herself if given the opportunity. She couldn't help it. Her need to prove she was winning, to demonstrate her superiority, was stronger than her self-preservation instinct. All I had to do was create a situation where she felt safe enough to drop her mask, where she believed victory was close enough to taste. I didn't need to trap her with documents or recordings. I needed to trap her with her own arrogance. A plan began forming in my mind, something simpler and more elegant than the legal maneuvering I'd been focused on. I would stop acting like her adversary and start acting like a defeated old man who'd finally accepted his place. I would give her what she wanted most, the thing she'd been craving since the moment Daniel died. I would give her the illusion that she'd won. I picked up my phone, scrolled to Madison's number, and composed a text message before I could second-guess myself. My finger hovered over the send button for a moment as I considered the risks, but Daniel's words echoed in my mind. "Watch how she looks at you when she thinks she's won. That's all the proof you need." I pressed send and waited. The message was simple, carefully worded to sound tired and conciliatory. Within minutes, 3 dots appeared on the screen, indicating she was typing. Her response came through brief and suspicious, but I could read the curiosity beneath it. I typed back, keeping my tone gentle, defeated. Another pause. Another response. We went back and forth 3 times before I made the invitation explicit. Finally, I called her directly. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice guarded. "Madison," I said, making sure I sounded weary, "I think it's time we stopped fighting. This isn't what Daniel would have wanted. Can we meet just the two of us? Dinner tonight. I'd like to make peace. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Madison calculating, weighing the risks and benefits of accepting my offer. Finally, she said, where her voice was still guarded, but I detected a note of interest, perhaps even anticipation. She wanted this meeting. She wanted the chance to see me surrender. I chose Marchand's, a quiet French restaurant in Midtown, with high-backed booths and dim lighting, the kind of place where conversations disappeared into burgundy leather and soft jazz. I'd called ahead and reserved a corner table, explaining to the hostess that I needed privacy for a difficult family discussion. She'd been sympathetic and accommodating. I arrived 45 minutes early and texted Laura Chen, an old friend who'd retired from the police department 5 years ago, after 3 decades as a detective. We'd met through a community safety committee I'd volunteered with, and we'd stayed in touch over the years, trading occasional emails and meeting for coffee when I visited the city. I need a favor, I wrote. No questions now. I'll explain everything later. Can you meet me at Marchand's in 30 minutes? Bring your phone. Laura's response came immediately. On my way. She arrived 20 minutes later, dressed casually in jeans and a blazer, looking like any other diner, enjoying a Thursday evening meal. I met her briefly in the entryway, speaking quickly and quietly. I need you to record a conversation. You'll be 3 tables away. The woman I'm meeting doesn't know you. She won't notice. Angle your phone so it captures both of us, but especially her. Audio is what matters most. Laura studied my face for a moment, and I saw the detective in her assessing the situation, reading the tension in my shoulders and the determination in my eyes. This legal? She asked. We're in a public restaurant, no expectation of privacy, and I'm not using this for court. I'm using it for truth. She nodded slowly. Okay, but you owe me a very long explanation over very expensive whiskey. Deal. Laura took her seat at a table positioned perfectly to capture the booth I'd reserved. She ordered a glass of wine and appeared to be scrolling through her phone, just another solitary diner passing time. I returned to my table and waited, forcing myself to relax my shoulders to let my posture slump slightly. When Madison walked through the door 10 minutes later, I made sure she saw a tired old man struggling with grief, not the calculating strategist I'd become. Madison had dressed for the occasion. She wore a navy dress that probably cost more than my monthly hotel bill. Her hair styled in loose waves, makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood lighting and angles. She looked younger than 32, vibrant and alive, and I realized with a sick feeling that she'd dressed this way deliberately to remind me of everything Daniel had lost when he died. She slid into the booth across from me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Edward, she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. Thank you for reaching out. I've been hoping we could move past all this unpleasantness. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, perhaps even a bit defeated. I've been thinking a lot about Daniel, I said quietly, about his life with you. I realize I probably didn't understand how difficult things were. Marriage is complicated, and I only saw the surface. Madison's posture shifted slightly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. She was buying it. It was complicated, she agreed. Daniel was a good man, but he had his challenges. I did my best to support him. I let silence settle between us while the waiter took our orders. When he left, I leaned forward slightly, my voice careful, curious. I've been wondering, and please forgive me if this is too personal, but how did you manage? When Daniel was difficult, he could be stubborn. I know that from raising him. Set in his ways. Madison's eyes lit up a flash of something eager and proud. She leaned in, mirroring my posture, and I saw the mask slip just slightly. It was simple, really, she said, her voice dropping to a confidential tone, as if she were sharing a secret between friends. Pressure and fear. Once I controlled the finances, once I made it clear that his comfort depended on my approval, he had no choice but to cooperate. I forced myself to nod sympathetically to keep my expression neutral, even as disgust rose in my throat. That must have been exhausting for you. It was, she said, warming to the subject now, unable to resist, demonstrating her cleverness. The anxiety medication helped, of course. He'd get so worked up about things, and I'd remind him to take his pills, sometimes double doses, when he was being particularly stubborn. And late-night arguments, those were effective too. Keep him off balance, never let him feel secure. By the end, he was so compliant. He barely made decisions without checking with me first. It was exhausting work, but it was effective. She paused to sip her wine, completely unaware of how thoroughly she'd just revealed herself. I glanced past her shoulder and saw Laura, her phone angled perfectly, her face carefully neutral. Our eyes met for just a second, and she tapped her phone screen once deliberately. Then she mouthed two words I could read clearly across the dim restaurant. Got it. It sounds like you had everything under control, I said quietly, and something in my tone must have registered because Madison's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. I did what I had to do, she said, her voice becoming defensive. Daniel needed structure. He needed someone to make decisions for him. I gave him that. The food arrived and we ate in relative silence, Madison clearly trying to gauge whether she'd said too much, whether my sympathetic demeanor was genuine or strategic. I kept my expression carefully neutral, asking innocuous questions about the apartment, about her plans for the future, letting her relax again into the belief that I was simply a grieving father trying to understand his son's life. When the check came, I paid without hesitation, leaving a generous tip. I stood slowly, using the edge of the table for support, playing the role of the elderly man one last time. Madison stood as well, smoothing her dress, her confidence fully restored now that the evening was ending without confrontation. I looked at her directly, let the mask drop just enough for her to see something shift in my expression. "Thank you, Madison," I said, my voice quiet but clear. That was very illuminating. I walked out of that restaurant knowing I held something dangerous in my hands, or rather in Laura's phone. We met the next morning at her apartment, and she transferred the video file to a secure drive while I watched the audio playing back with crystal clarity. Madison's voice confident and cruel, describing exactly how she'd manipulated my son into submission. Laura said nothing while it played, but when it ended, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What are you going to do with this?" she asked. I told her I didn't know yet, but I'd know when the time was right. She made me promise I wouldn't do anything reckless, and I assured her that everything I did from this point forward would be calculated, deliberate, and entirely within the bounds of what Madison herself had set in motion. 3 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another condolence call from someone who'd just heard about Daniel's death, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. "Is this Edward Cole?" The voice was soft, elderly, with a slight tremor that suggested age or uncertainty, or both. "Yes, this is Edward. My name is Diane Harper." There was a pause, as if she were gathering courage. "I'm Madison's mother. I need to speak with you." I sat down slowly on the edge of the hotel bed, processing what I'd just heard. Madison had a mother. A living mother. In every conversation I'd ever had with Daniel about his in-laws, he'd mentioned that Madison's parents were both deceased, that she'd grown up essentially orphaned, raised by an aunt who'd since passed away. It was part of Madison's narrative, the tragic backstory that explained her drive, her need for security and status. "Madison told us you were dead," I said finally. "I know," Diane replied, and I heard something like resignation in her voice. "She's been telling people that for 15 years. I'd like to meet with you if you're willing. I have things you should know." We arranged to meet the following afternoon. Diane lived in an assisted living facility called Meadowbrook in Westchester, about an hour north of the city. I drove up through autumn countryside, leaves turning gold and red, the kind of scenery that would have felt peaceful under different circumstances. The facility was modest but well-maintained, a 2-story building with a garden out front and a sign advertising activities like bingo and watercolor classes. Diane was waiting for me in the common room. A small woman in her late 60s with gray hair pulled back in a bun, and eyes that were remarkably clear and sharp despite the frailty of her frame. She gestured to a quiet corner away from the television where several other residents were watching a game show. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I should," I admitted. "But I need to understand who Madison really is, and I suspect you can tell me things no one else can." Diane reached beside her chair and lifted a shoebox onto the table between us, the kind that had once held a pair of inexpensive sneakers but now served as a container for something far more valuable. She opened it carefully, and inside were dozens of envelopes, all addressed in the same careful handwriting to Madison Cole at various addresses over the years. Every single one was stamped with a red return to sender mark. "I wrote to her every month for 15 years, Diane said, her hands shaking slightly as she touched the envelopes. "Birthdays, holidays, sometimes just because I missed her. Not one reply. Not one acknowledgement. She tells people I'm dead because to her I might as well be. I picked up one of the envelopes noting the date 8 years ago, around the time Madison and Daniel were married. Why did she cut you off? Diane's expression was pained but honest. Madison learned cruelty young, and I won't pretend I was a perfect mother. I was poor, working 2 jobs just to keep us housed and fed. I couldn't give her the life she saw other children having, the nice clothes, the dance lessons, the vacations. She resented me for that. When she got her first corporate job and met people with money, people with status, she decided I was an embarrassment. When she married Daniel, she erased me completely, told him and everyone else that I'd died years before. I set the envelope back in the box carefully. She's done terrible things since Daniel died. Worse than abandoning you. I know, Diane said quietly. I've been following the news, the funeral, the apartment, all of it. That's why I'm calling you now. She looked at me directly, and despite her trembling hands and soft voice, there was steel in her gaze. If you need me to speak the truth about her, if you need someone to testify to who Madison really is, I will. She deserves to hear it from me. She deserves to finally face the person she spent half her life pretending doesn't exist. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently, feeling the papery texture of her skin, the fragility of bones that had carried too much burden for too long. You're not dead, Diane, I said quietly. You're the mirror she's been running from her whole life. I left Meadowbrook that afternoon with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since the funeral. Diane had given me her phone number and made me promise to keep her informed of whatever happened next. As I drove back to the city, I thought about Madison's pattern of erasure, how she'd systematically removed anyone from her life who reminded her of where she'd come from or who she really was. Daniel had been too kind to see it. I wouldn't make that mistake. That evening, I met Laura at her apartment. We sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open between us, the dinner recording queued up and ready. Laura had already watched it twice, taking notes on timestamps and audio quality. Now she looked at me seriously and asked, "Are you sure about this? Once it's out there, you can't take it back?" "I'm sure," I said. Madison's been controlling the narrative since the moment Daniel died. It's time people heard the truth. We spent 2 hours editing the footage down to a tight 2-minute clip, focusing on Madison's most damning statements. Her voice was clear, almost cheerful, as she described using pressure and fear to control Daniel, how she'd manipulated his anxiety medication, how she'd kept him off balance with late-night arguments until he became what she called compliant. We didn't add music or commentary. We didn't need to. Madison's own words were devastating enough. Laura uploaded the video anonymously to a local news tip line and several social media platforms using accounts that couldn't be traced back to either of us. We chose a simple caption, Madison Cole, in her own words, 3 weeks after her husband's funeral. Then we waited. Within 6 hours, the video had been picked up by a local news blog. Within 12 hours, it was trending on multiple platforms. By the next morning, it had gone viral. I watched the view count climb from thousands to hundreds of thousands, then into the millions. The comments sections filled with outrage, disgust, and condemnation. People who'd never met Daniel or Madison felt personally betrayed by her casual cruelty. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Madison's Instagram, which she'd maintained as a carefully curated showcase of her lifestyle and charitable work, was flooded with angry comments. Sponsors who'd supported her various fundraising events released statements distancing themselves from her. A local blogger published a scathing piece titled "The Widow Who Laughed at Grief," dissecting Madison's performance of mourning versus the reality captured on video. Former friends posted vague messages about being deceived, about not really knowing someone. Madison's entire social infrastructure collapsed in less than 48 hours. She posted a tearful video response filmed in the apartment's bedroom with soft lighting and tissues in hand. She claimed the recording was taken out of context, that I'd manipulated her into saying things she didn't mean, that grief had made her say terrible things she didn't believe. But her defensive tone, the way her eyes kept darting off camera, the slight pause before each denial, it all made her seem less credible, not more. The video only accelerated her fall. 2 days after the recording went viral, Madison came to the apartment. I heard her key in the lock, then the door slamming open. She stormed into the living room where I sat reading Daniel's letters, her face flushed with rage, her hands shaking. "You recorded me," she screamed. You manipulated me into saying those things. You set me up. I set down the letter I'd been reading and looked at her calmly. I didn't manipulate you, Madison. I gave you an audience. You performed, just like you always do. This is harassment. This is defamation. I'll sue you for everything you have. I'll destroy you. You did this to yourself, I said quietly. Every word on that recording came from your mouth. Every choice that led to this moment was yours. I just made sure people could see who you really are. Her phone rang, the sound cutting through her tirade. She grabbed it from her purse, and I watched her face change as she listened to whoever was on the other end. The color drained from her cheeks. Her hand went to her throat. She ended the call and stood there for a moment, swaying slightly before turning back to me with eyes that now held something closer to fear than rage. That was my lawyer, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He says we need to prepare for legal action. Civil suits, character witnesses, court proceedings. She straightened her shoulders, trying to reclaim some dignity, but I could see the cracks in her armor now, the places where panic was seeping through. I'll see you in court, Edward. She left without another word, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through the apartment. I sat there for a long time afterward, the silence pressing in around me, and I felt a weariness that had nothing to do with age. This was war, now formal and legal, and I knew Madison wouldn't fight fair. She never had. 4 days later, a process server appeared at my door. He handed me a thick envelope containing a petition for a temporary restraining order. Madison's lawyer had filed it that morning, claiming I was engaged in a campaign of harassment and defamation designed to destroy her reputation and emotional well-being. The petition was thorough, almost impressive in its construction. It included screenshots of the viral video transcripts of our text message exchanges leading up to the dinner and sworn statements from 2 of Madison's friends, claiming I'd been calling and threatening her. That last part was a lie, but it was stated under penalty of perjury with signatures and dates that made it look official. The petition argued that the restaurant recording had been made without Madison's knowledge or consent, that I deliberately manipulated a grieving widow into making statements that could be misconstrued, and that releasing the video publicly constituted intentional infliction of emotional distress. A judge had already granted a temporary order. I was required to stay at least 100 feet away from Madison at all times, pending a full hearing in 2 weeks. I read through the document twice, my hands steady but my mind racing. This was Madison's counterattack, and it was smarter than I'd expected. By framing herself as the victim of a vindictive father-in-law, she was trying to shift the narrative to make the video seem like the product of manipulation, rather than a window into truth. The restraining order was strategic, too. It limited my ability to respond, to confront her, to continue gathering evidence. She was buying herself time and space to rebuild her defenses. That night alone in the apartment, I found myself questioning everything I'd done since Daniel's death. I sat in the living room with the lights off, looking out at the city, spread below thousands of windows, glowing in the darkness, each one representing lives. I knew nothing about people facing their own battles. I thought about the video about Madison's face when she'd realized what I'd done about the millions of people who'd watched her words and judged her. Had I become like her? Was I using cruelty as a weapon, justifying it because my target deserved it? Daniel had been kind. He'd been gentle even when Madison had systematically broken him down. He'd set up a trust for Emma without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. He'd tried to build a foundation that would help others even when his own life was falling apart. And here I was, his father, releasing videos and engineering public humiliation. I picked up one of Daniel's unsent letters, the one where he'd written about feeling invisible, and I read it again in the dim light. Finish what I started, he'd written at the end. But what had he started? Revenge. Or something else entirely. The knock on my door came around 9. Laura stood in the hallway, 2 cups of coffee in her hands, and her expression that suggested she'd heard about the restraining order. I let her in without speaking, and we sat at the kitchen table while she studied my face. "You're doubting yourself," she said. It wasn't a question. "I released that video to hurt her," I said. "To destroy her reputation. To punish her." "How is that different from what she did to Daniel?" "Because you didn't lie," Laura said firmly. "You didn't fabricate evidence or manipulate facts. You recorded her in a public place, saying things she genuinely believed. You let her show the world who she really is. That's not cruelty, Edward. That's accountability." "It feels like cruelty." "Good," Laura said. "It should. That means you're still human. That means you're not becoming Madison. She leaned forward, her cop instincts fully engaged now. But here's what you need to understand. She's desperate. This restraining order, this lawsuit she's planning, these are the moves of someone who's cornered. And desperate people make mistakes. Your job now is to be patient. Let her overplay her hand. Let her build a case on lies and half-truths, and then we dismantle it piece by piece. I wanted to believe her, but the doubt lingered. What if I've gone too far? Then we'll deal with that, Laura said. But I don't think you have. I think you've just started holding someone accountable who's spent her entire adult life avoiding consequences. She left an hour later, and I tried to sleep, but couldn't. My mind kept circling back to Daniel's letter to his final request. Finish what I started. Maybe he hadn't meant revenge at all. Maybe he'd meant the foundation, the legacy of helping others that Madison had blocked. Maybe the real way to honor Daniel wasn't to destroy Madison, but to build something she could never take credit for. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. I signed for it and opened the envelope with hands that had regained their steadiness. Inside was a summons and complaint. Madison was filing a civil lawsuit against me for fraud, elder abuse, and defamation, seeking $2 million in damages. The complaint was extensive, alleging a pattern of manipulation and exploitation spanning from the moment of Daniel's death to the present. It portrayed me as a cruel opportunist, taking advantage of a vulnerable young widow. I set the papers down carefully and called Harris. We need to prepare for trial, I said, and I need you to help me understand exactly what Daniel meant when he said to finish what he started. The 6 months between that certified letter and the trial were a blur of depositions, motions, and legal maneuvering. Madison's lawyers were aggressive, filing motion after motion to suppress evidence, to dismiss claims, to delay proceedings. Harris countered each one methodically, and slowly the discovery process revealed patterns even I hadn't fully understood. Bank records showing Madison had begun draining joint accounts weeks before Daniel's death. Text messages between her and Evan discussing asset liquidation while Daniel was still alive. Testimony from Daniel's colleagues about how isolated he'd become in his final months. The case Harris built wasn't just about the apartment or the viral video anymore. It was about a pattern of emotional and financial manipulation that had consumed the last years of my son's life. The trial began on a cold January morning, 6 months almost to the day from when I'd received Madison's lawsuit. The courtroom was packed. Press sat in the back rows, notebooks ready. Daniel's old friends filled the gallery, their faces somber. I recognized Robert Chen, the colleague who'd told me about Daniel's phone call. I saw neighbors from the apartment building, people who'd witnessed Madison's transformation from grieving widow to social pariah. The room hummed with anticipation and judgment. Madison sat at the plaintiff's table with her legal team, dressed in a conservative gray suit that suggested humility and victimhood. Her hair was pulled back, simply, her makeup minimal. She'd learned from her mistakes, crafted a new image for this audience. Her lawyer, a silver-haired man named Patterson, opened with a passionate argument about how Edward Cole had exploited a young widow's grief, manipulating her into damaging statements and then weaponizing those statements to destroy her reputation. He painted me as a bitter old man seeking revenge for imagined slights. Harris's opening was quieter but more devastating. He spoke about Daniel, about the kind man who'd tried to build something meaningful, who'd supported a child his wife had abandoned, who'd planned a foundation his wife had blocked out of vanity. He described Madison's systematic isolation of Daniel, her control over his finances, her pattern of erasure that extended even to her own mother. This isn't a case about revenge, Harris said, looking directly at the jury. It's a case about accountability, and about a father's duty to protect his son's memory from someone who's spent 8 years trying to erase it. The trial proceeded through witnesses and documents each day, building a more complete picture of Madison's character. But the moment that changed everything came on the 3rd day when Harris called Diane Harper to the stand. Diane walked slowly to the witness box, her frailty evident, but her spine straight, her eyes clear. She was sworn in, and Harris began gently asking about her relationship with Madison. Diane spoke calmly, describing how Madison had cut off all contact 15 years ago, how she'd told people her mother was dead, how the shoebox of returned letters represented 15 years of attempted connection met with absolute silence. Patterson objected repeatedly, trying to argue relevance, but the judge overruled him each time. This went to character, to pattern, to Madison's willingness to erase people who didn't serve her narrative. When Patterson finally got his chance to cross-examine, he tried to attack Diane's credibility, suggesting she was a negligent mother, that Madison had legitimate reasons for the estrangement. Diane absorbed each question without flinching. "Were you a perfect mother?" Patterson asked, his tone sharp. "No," Diane said simply. "I was poor. I worked constantly. I couldn't give Madison the material things she wanted. But I loved her. I still do." "Then, why should this court believe anything you say? You're clearly bitter about being rejected." "Love doesn't mean lying for someone who refuses to love themselves," Diane said, her voice steady. "I'm here to tell the truth. What Madison does with it is her choice." Patterson sat down, and Harris had no redirect. The testimony stood on its own. But then came Madison's cross-examination, and I watched as everything Patterson had carefully constructed began to crumble. Harris asked about the dinner recording, about whether Madison stood by her statements. Madison's composure held through the first few questions, but as Harris pressed, asking about specific phrases about the manipulation she'd described, her voice grew tight, defensive. "Those statements were taken out of context," she insisted. "What context makes pressure and fear acceptable tools in a marriage?" Harris asked. "You don't understand what it was like living with him. With Daniel, your husband, the man you're now suing to protect." The memory of Madison's face flushed. "My mother had no right to be here. She was nothing to me. She gave me nothing." The courtroom went completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. Madison seemed to realize what she'd said, but it was too late. Her own lawyer looked away, and I saw several jury members exchange glances. The judge called a recess, his voice cutting through the stunned quiet. As people filed out, I watched Madison sit alone at her table, head in her hands, her careful image shattered by her own words. Diane walked past the plaintiff's table without looking at her daughter, moving slowly toward the exit. At the door she paused, turned back, and found me in the crowd. She squeezed my hand gently, her eyes sad but somehow at peace. "Now she's finally heard me," Diane whispered. The trial concluded 2 days later with a verdict that surprised no one who'd been paying attention. The jury found in my favor on all counts, awarding me nothing in damages because I'd asked for nothing. I'd only wanted the truth established in a court of record, and that's what I got. Madison was ordered to pay court costs and attorney fees. More importantly, the judge's ruling included findings of fact about her character, her manipulation of Daniel, and her pattern of deceit. It was a legal document, but it read like an indictment of everything she'd become. Harris had been strategic during the trial, introducing Daniel's guardian trust, not as evidence of financial malfeasance, but as proof of Daniel's character and foresight. He'd shown the jury how my son had quietly supported a child Madison had abandoned, how he'd planned for Emma's future, even while his own marriage was crumbling. The trust documents made it clear that Daniel had named me as successor trustee, a role the judge formally recognized in his ruling. 2 weeks after the verdict, with Madison's appeal denied and her legal options exhausted, the court finalized my guardianship of the trust. Madison was officially excluded from any claim to the funds or any say in Emma's future. I'd known about Emma for months by that point, had been funding the trust payments and working with Harris to understand my legal responsibilities. But I hadn't met her yet. I'd wanted to wait until the legal situation was resolved, until I could approach her not as a stranger caught in a legal battle, but as someone who had the right and the means to be part of her life. Now, with the court's blessing and the trust secure, it was time. The foster home was in Brooklyn, a renovated brownstone on a tree-lined street where children's bicycles leaned against iron railings and window boxes held flowers despite the late winter cold. The foster mother, a woman named Teresa, with warm eyes and 20 years of experience, had been briefed by social services about my visit. She welcomed me into a living room that managed to feel both orderly and lived in, where 3 other children were doing homework at a large dining table. "Emma's upstairs," Teresa said quietly. "She knows someone's coming to visit." I told her it was someone who knew her Uncle Daniel. "She's been nervous all morning." I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart beating harder than it had even in the courtroom. At the end of the hallway, a door stood half open, and I could see a small figure sitting on a bed, a book open in her lap but clearly unread. I knocked gently. "Emma." "My name is Edward Cole. May I come in?" She looked up, and I felt my breath catch. She was small for 8, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that were solemn and watchful. But it was her face that stopped me, the shape of her features, the way her eyebrows drew together when she was uncertain. She looked strikingly like Daniel had at that age, like photographs I'd kept in albums for decades, and the resemblance was so strong it felt like seeing my son again, given a second chance in a different form. "Okay," she said, softly closing the book. I entered and sat in a chair near the bed, keeping distance between us, not wanting to overwhelm her. "I knew your Uncle Daniel very well," I said. "He was my son." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "Are you my Uncle Daniel's dad?" My throat tightened and I had to pause before answering. "Yes, and he wanted to make sure you were taken care of. He set up a special fund for you to help you with school and whatever else you need. Now that he's gone, it's my job to keep that going." She processed this silently, her hands folded in her lap. "I miss him," she said finally. "He used to visit sometimes. He brought me books and asked about school. He never told me he was sick." "He wasn't sick," I said gently. "His heart stopped working one day. It was very sudden. He didn't suffer and he didn't have time to say goodbye to anyone." Emma nodded, tears forming in her eyes. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out Daniel's watch, the one I'd carried since the funeral, the one that held his final message to me. I held it out to her. "This belonged to your uncle. He gave it to me a long time ago and I gave it back to him and he left it for me when he died. Now I'm giving it to you. It means someone loved you enough to plan for your future, to make sure you'd be okay even when they couldn't be here." Emma took the watch carefully, turning it over in her small hands, examining the engraved case and the Roman numerals on its face. She opened the back, saw the empty space where Daniel's note had been, and looked up at me, with questions in her eyes. "Can I call you Grandpa?" she whispered. I knelt down beside the bed, my knees protesting, but my heart suddenly lighter than it had been in months. My voice broke as I answered. "I'd be honored." Emma and I spent that first afternoon together cautiously, like two people learning a new language together. She showed me her schoolwork, her drawings, the books Daniel had given her. By the time I left, we'd agreed I would visit every Saturday, and Teresa had already begun the paperwork that would allow me to be more formally involved in Emma's life. Driving back to the city, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Daniel's death, a sense of forward motion, of building something rather than dismantling it. Daniel had left me this gift, this child who needed someone to believe in her, and I intended to honor that trust completely. The months following the trial were strange ones. Madison had lost in court, lost in public opinion, and lost whatever remained of her social standing. I expected her to disappear, to leave the city and start over somewhere no one knew her name. Instead, she tried to rebuild. 4 months after the verdict, she launched a blog called Rising Through Resilience, positioning herself as a survivor of false accusations and public persecution. The prose was polished, clearly written by someone with marketing experience, and it attempted to reframe the entire narrative. She wrote about the dangers of social media mobs, about how recordings could be manipulated, about the tragedy of losing her husband and then being attacked by his father. But the public wasn't buying it. I knew because Emma's foster mother mentioned seeing articles about it, because Laura sent me screenshots with raised eyebrows, because even the doorman at the apartment asked me one day if I'd seen what that woman is up to. Now, the comment sections on Madison's blog posts were brutal. People who'd watched the trial, who'd seen Diane's testimony, who'd heard Madison's own words, weren't interested in her reinvention. One commenter wrote something that seemed to capture the collective sentiment. You can't rebuild a reputation on the same lies that destroyed it. Madison tried other avenues. She reached out to lifestyle brands offering to be a spokesperson for women's empowerment or mental health awareness. Every company declined, some publicly stating they didn't align with her values. She attempted to speak at a conference about overcoming adversity. The organizers disinvited her after attendees threatened to boycott. Her Instagram, which she'd tried to resurrect with carefully staged photos and inspirational quotes, remained a graveyard of negative comments that she eventually stopped trying to moderate. Each attempt at comeback only reminded people of why she'd fallen in the first place. During this time, Diane and I had stayed in regular contact. She'd begun visiting Emma with me on Saturdays and watching grandmother and granddaughter together, one meeting the other. For the first time, building something fragile and new felt like a kind of healing neither of them had expected. Diane had more energy these days, a sense of purpose that her doctor said was doing more for her health than any medication could. One afternoon, while Emma played in Teresa's backyard, Diane turned to me with a request. "I want my daughter's name removed from the places she used to claim credit," she said quietly. "The charities, the donor walls, the event programs. She used those organizations for her image, never for their missions. They deserve better than to be associated with her." I helped her draft letters, simple and factual, explaining the situation and requesting that Madison's name be removed from donor rolls and recognition materials. We didn't threaten or demand. We simply asked organizations to consider whether they wanted to remain associated with someone whose character had been so thoroughly exposed. One by one, nonprofits responded. The Literacy Foundation removed her name from their annual gala program. The Women's Shelter took down her photo from their donor wall. The Hospital Auxiliary quietly deleted her from their website. It wasn't legal punishment. It was communal rejection, the kind that happens when a community decides someone has violated the unspoken contract of decency that holds society together. I didn't take pleasure in Madison's erasure, but I didn't mourn it either. She'd spent years building a facade, and now that facade was being dismantled piece by piece. What remained was simply the truth of who she'd always been visible now, to everyone who'd once been fooled by the performance. 6 months after the trial, a local news anchor did a retrospective piece on the case for a human interest segment. I watched it from the apartment one evening, Emma asleep in what had become her room during weekend visits. The anchor, a woman in her 50s, with the measured tone of someone who'd covered countless stories, spoke directly to the camera. The case of Edward Cole versus Madison Cole captivated our city not because of legal drama, but because of what it revealed about truth and accountability, she said. In the court of public opinion, justice came not through sentencing or punishment, but simply through letting people see clearly what had been hidden. Edward Cole didn't destroy his daughter-in-law's reputation. He simply held up a mirror. What the public saw reflected there was Madison Cole's own doing. The segment included brief interviews with legal experts, clips from the trial, and a statement from Harris about how civil cases sometimes serve purposes beyond financial compensation. It ended with footage of me and Emma at a park, clearly taken without our knowledge, just a grandfather and granddaughter feeding ducks. The anchor's final words were, "Sometimes the most powerful justice is the quietest. Sometimes it's simply being seen." I turned off the television and sat in the silence of the apartment. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Madison's downfall. What I felt was a quiet sense that something had reached its natural conclusion, that accountability had arrived not through vengeance, but through the patient accumulation of truth. Justice, I realized, didn't always come with gavels and sentencing. Sometimes it came through the steady withdrawal of the approval Madison had always craved, the realization that no amount of blog posts or rebranding could undo what people had seen with their own eyes. The next morning, I saw a news clip on my phone that Laura had forwarded. A reporter had ambushed Madison outside the apartment building, microphone, extended camera rolling. "Mrs. Cole, do you regret anything?" the reporter asked. Madison's face was carefully blank as she pushed past without answering, her lawyer appearing from nowhere to block the camera. But the footage captured everything: the isolation, the refusal to acknowledge, accountability, the image of a woman walking away alone while questions about regret hung unanswered in the air. I deleted the video clip without watching it again. Madison's isolation was complete, and there was nothing more I needed to see. My focus had shifted entirely to Emma, to the trust fund that would secure her education, and to something else that had been growing in my mind since I'd first found that dusty folder in Daniel's storage unit. One evening after Emma had gone to bed during one of her weekend stays, I pulled out the manila folder labeled The Madison Cole Foundation Proposal Draft 2015 and read it thoroughly for the first time. I'd skimmed it before understanding the basic concept, but now I read every page with the attention I'd once given to bridge specifications and load calculations. What I found was remarkable. Madison had written a comprehensive blueprint for a charitable organization that would provide scholarships for young widows trying to complete their education fund, heart disease research, and support literacy programs in underserved communities. The mission statement was eloquent and genuinely moving, describing how opportunity could transform lives, how education could break cycles of poverty, how no one should have to choose between grieving and surviving. The financial projections were realistic and well-researched. The partnership strategies showed an understanding of how nonprofits built sustainable funding. The governance structure was thoughtful. designed to prevent any single person from controlling the foundation's direction. Every section demonstrated real work, real thought, real passion for the cause. This hadn't been a vanity project Madison had sketched out over a weekend. She'd invested months, maybe longer, into creating something that could have genuinely mattered. And then, she'd abandoned it completely because Daniel had suggested joint leadership, because he'd wanted his name alongside hers, because she couldn't bear to share credit with the man she'd married. In the margins, Daniel had written notes, suggestions for expanding the scholarship criteria, contacts at medical schools who might partner on the heart disease research ideas for corporate sponsors. He'd been excited about it, ready to help make it real. But Madison's response, written in her sharp handwriting at the bottom of the governance page, was brutally clear. If I can't own this completely, I won't do it at all. I closed the folder and sat there for a long time thinking about the irony of what I held in my hands. Madison had designed something beautiful and then killed it out of pride. Daniel had tried to save it and failed. And now I had the power to resurrect it in a way that would serve as both tribute and judgment, honoring my son, while using Madison's own words to demonstrate what she could have been if she'd valued impact over image. The next morning, I called Harris. I want to establish a foundation, I said. The Daniel Cole Foundation. And I want to use Madison's original proposal as the blueprint. Every word of it. There was a pause on the line. You want to use her work. I want to use her work to honor Daniel's memory. She wrote the mission statement, the programs, the structure. We'll implement it exactly as she designed it, but we'll credit Daniel as the visionary who tried to make it happen. Her name won't appear anywhere. Harris was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him considering the legal and ethical implications. That's poetic, he finally said, and potentially complicated. We'll need to be careful about intellectual property. The proposal was found in Daniel's files. It was never copyrighted or formally published. And given that Madison publicly abandoned any claim to charitable work after the trial, I think we're on solid ground. But you're the lawyer. Make sure we do this right. Over the next 3 months, Harris and I worked with a team of nonprofit experts to establish the Daniel Cole Foundation. We used Madison's proposal as our foundation, no pun intended, but we made sure every piece of paperwork, every filing, every legal document was impeccable. We established the scholarship fund with enough capital to support 10 students annually. We partnered with a medical research center for the Heart Disease Initiative. We connected with literacy organizations that had been doing this work for decades and knew how to deploy resources effectively. The board of directors was carefully selected: Harris, Laura, Diane, myself, and 3 community leaders who'd known Daniel and believed in the mission. We held our first official meeting in a conference room Harris had donated, and as I read through Madison's original mission statement to open the meeting, I felt Daniel's presence in a way I hadn't since the funeral. This was what he'd wanted. Not revenge, not public humiliation, not legal victories. He'd wanted to build something that would outlast him, that would help people who were struggling the way he'd struggled in those final years. The foundation's launch ceremony was scheduled for 6 months after our first board meeting. We'd spent that time building partnerships, securing funding, and spreading word through the networks Daniel had belonged to: his engineering colleagues, his university alumni association, the literacy organization he'd volunteered with before Madison had consumed all his free time. The response was overwhelming. People who'd known Daniel wanted to honor him. Organizations that served the communities we'd be helping wanted to partner. Even the press showed interest, seeing the human interest angle of a father turning grief into purpose. The ceremony took place on a sunny afternoon in May in the community center where we'd established our offices. More than 200 people attended. Local officials gave speeches about the importance of community-driven philanthropy. Daniel's college friend Robert spoke about Daniel's generosity and vision. And then it was my turn to speak, to formally announce the foundation's mission and programs. I stood at the podium with Madison's proposal in my hands, the pages she'd written 9 years ago, now the founding document of an organization that would carry my son's name into the future. The cameras from 3 local news stations were recording. Journalists had their notebooks open. In the front row, Emma sat between Diane and Teresa, wearing a blue dress and holding Daniel's pocket watch in her lap. I began reading the mission statement exactly as Madison had written it. The Daniel Cole Foundation exists because we believe that hardship should not determine destiny. We believe that when someone loses a partner, they shouldn't also lose their future. We believe education is a right, not a privilege. We believe heart disease research saves lives. We believe literacy transforms communities. And we believe that one person's vision carried forward by people who share that vision can change the world in ways both large and small. The words were Madison's, but they honored Daniel, and that transformation felt like the truest form of justice. I continued reading, describing the scholarship program, the research partnerships, the literacy initiatives, and as I spoke, I saw people nodding, saw them responding to the genuine passion in Madison's original prose. She'd written something good once, before pride had corrupted it. Now that goodness would exist in the world, but she would receive none of the credit, none of the recognition, none of the legacy she'd craved. After the ceremony, after the photographs and congratulations and commitments from donors who wanted to support what we were building, I drove home through the city streets, feeling a sense of completion I hadn't known I was seeking. The foundation was real now. It would help people. It would carry Daniel's name forward. And Madison, somewhere in her small apartment on the Upper East Side, would know exactly what had happened. I learned later from Laura, who'd heard from a former colleague in the media, that Madison had watched the ceremony coverage on the evening news. She'd been alone in the apartment when the segment aired, the same apartment she paid rent on every month, the same space where she'd once imagined herself as the center of everything. The reporter had captured my reading of the mission statement, had interviewed several scholarship recipients, had shown footage of Emma presenting flowers to Diane. And Madison had heard her own words, the ones she'd written nearly a decade ago, being used to honor the husband she'd manipulated and the father-in-law she'd tried to destroy. According to Laura's source, Madison had watched the entire segment without moving, and when it ended, she'd laughed a bitter, broken sound that turned into tears and whispered to her empty apartment, a recognition that arrived too late to change anything. He used my words to erase me. The year that followed the foundation's launch passed in a way that felt both quick and earned, filled with the kind of purposeful work that makes time move differently. Emma came to live with me permanently 6 months after the ceremony, after months of paperwork and home studies and meetings with social workers who needed to be certain an elderly man could properly care for a young girl. She kept Daniel's watch on her nightstand, and every morning when I made her breakfast before school, I felt my son's presence in the small routines of caring for someone he'd loved. The foundation grew faster than any of us had anticipated. The scholarship program received over 300 applications in its first year. The Heart Disease Research Partnership published preliminary findings that showed promise. The literacy programs reached nearly 2,000 children. We hired a small staff, opened a proper office, and began planning expansion. Diane served on the board with dedication that belied her age, attending every meeting with the careful attention of someone who understood what it meant to need help and not receive it. The foundation's first anniversary celebration was scheduled for a Saturday in June, exactly 1 year after our launch. We'd rented the same community hall, now familiar and comfortable, and filled it with everyone who'd made the year successful. Scholarship recipients came with their families. Volunteers brought their students. Medical researchers presented their progress. It felt less like a fundraiser and more like a reunion for people who'd never met before but shared a common purpose. I stood at the podium as afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows. Emma sat in the front row between Diane and Laura, wearing a yellow dress and clapping enthusiastically. She'd grown 2 inches in the past year and lost a front tooth that gave her smile a gap that made her look even more like Daniel had at that age. Diane looked stronger than she had 12 months ago, her eyes bright, her posture straighter, as if having someone to live for had added years back to her life. "Thank you all for being here," I began. "A year ago, we started this foundation with a simple mission to help people who were struggling to honor my son Daniel's memory and to prove that good work can come from grief. Today, I'm proud to announce that we've awarded 10 full scholarships, funded 2 major research initiatives, and provided literacy support to over 2,000 children. But more than that, we've built something that will outlast all of us." I paused, looking out at faces I'd come to know. A year ago, I thought justice meant punishment. I thought honoring my son meant making sure the person who hurt him faced consequences. I was wrong. Real justice is building what others tried to destroy. My son didn't leave me wealth. He left me something more valuable. He left me purpose. I glanced down at Emma, who was watching me with serious attention. And he left me family I didn't know I needed. Together, Emma and I announced this year's scholarship recipients. There were 12 this time, our resources having grown through donations and partnerships. Each one was a young widow trying to complete education interrupted by loss. Each one was proof that Madison's original vision, stripped of vanity and executed with genuine care, could actually change lives. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, people drifted outside to the Foundation's small garden, a space we'd planted in spring with flowers and benches and paths designed for quiet reflection. I'd saved one task for the end of the day. With Harris and Laura's help, we'd commissioned a young oak tree to be planted at the garden's entrance. At its base was a bronze plaque engraved with simple words, "In memory of Daniel Cole, builder of futures." As the sun began its descent, painting the sky orange and pink, I stood with Emma and Diane and helped position the tree in the prepared hole. Emma poured in the first ceremonial shovelful of soil, her small hands gripping the tool with determination. Diane added the second, her movements slow but steady. And I added the third, pressing earth around the roots with care learned from 4 decades of understanding how foundations must be solid to support what gets built above them. Inside the hall, scholarship recipients were laughing together, comparing stories. In the garden, volunteers had lit small lanterns that glowed softly in the gathering dusk. Emma ran between them, her yellow dress bright against the darkening grass, her laughter carrying on the evening air. Diane sat on a bench nearby, watching her granddaughter with an expression of peace I'd never seen before. I stood beside the newly planted oak, my hand resting on its slender trunk, and looked through the glass doors at the framed photograph of Daniel we'd mounted in the lobby. It was from his college graduation, his smile wide and genuine, his eyes bright with hope. I'd chosen that photo deliberately, wanting people to see him as he'd been before Madison, before the slow erosion of joy that had marked their marriage. The bark beneath my palm was smooth and cool, unmarked by time, full of potential for growth. I thought about Madison in her apartment across town, about the 5 words I'd spoken at the funeral that had started all of this, about the long path from anger to purpose. I thought about Daniel's letter and how I'd finally understood what he'd meant. Not revenge, not punishment, just building, just making sure the best parts of who he'd been continued to exist in the world. I touched the tree's young bark one final time and whispered to the evening air, to Daniel's memory, to the future that stretched ahead. She buried her future. I built mine. That's the justice I can live with. The lanterns in the garden continued to glow as darkness settled fully over the city, and I stood there for a long moment, watching Emma's silhouette against the warm light spilling from the hall. Tomorrow she'd go to school, and I'd review foundation applications, and Diane would send her weekly letters to organizations asking them to support our work. Life would continue in its ordinary way, built on the extraordinary foundation Daniel had unknowingly laid when he'd chosen compassion over bitterness, when he'd supported a child no one else would claim, when he'd left me that final message about finishing what he'd started. I walked back toward the hall, toward the celebration that was winding down, but not yet over, toward the people who'd chosen to build rather than destroy. Madison's words had become Daniel's legacy. Her abandoned dream had become a reality that bore his name. And I, an old engineer who'd thought he understood structures, had learned that the strongest foundations aren't made of concrete and steel, but of purpose and love, and the stubborn refusal to let cruelty have the final word. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who mistook your kindness for weakness? Have you turned pain into purpose, or watched someone you loved struggle in a relationship that slowly erased them? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you believe, as I do, that the best revenge is building something beautiful from the ruins someone else created, subscribe for more stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to choose healing over hatred. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to become the person who hurt us, and instead become the person who builds what they tried to destroy.